a little theatrical bit of magic.
Yes.
Here.
Enter stage right.
I'll go ahead and introduce you.
Yes, please.
All right, well, welcome everyone. I am from Advancement Alumni Relations, but I am here to introduce you to David Peritz. David has a BA from Occidental College and a doctorate of philosophy in politics from Oxford University. He has taught political theory at Sarah Lawrence since 2001, specializing in modern and contemporary political philosophy. His research focuses on democracy in conditions of cultural diversity and social complexity. That doesn't happen much, though, so that's a very rarefied topic. And the relationship between democracy, justice, equality in increasingly unequal social worlds. He is a recipient of a Marshall Scholarship, taught at Harvard University and Deep Springs College before coming to Sarah Lawrence, and is a regular visiting member of the faculty at Dartmouth, as well as teaching occasionally as a visitor at Cornell and UC Berkeley. He has been a visiting scholar at Erasmus University Rotterdam, at the London School of Economics. Finally, David is one of 3 faculty members who will be teaching this fall in the inaugural semester of the Intensive Semester in Yonkers program, an interdisciplinary, comprehensive, semester-long program that provides students the chance to explore in depth some of the social, historical, economic, and environmental issues that face contemporary urban America, as well as some of the opportunities available to meet those challenges by focusing on an immersive study of and work in Yonkers.
Sorry to put you through that.
Are you kidding? That was fabulous. I think we're all like blown away.
Yeah. Welcome. Hello. I'm David, and this is a slightly awkward room to do a Sarah Lawrence style discussion in. We should be around a table together. I'm sitting, and I want us to have a conversation. I did a version of this morning, and we did have a conversation. So I'll say 2 things.
We could regroup the chairs in a circle.
We can regroup the chairs in a
Yeah.
circle.
Yeah.
I think we should do that.
Okay. Good. I don't know if you know, they're doing a major renovation of the library this summer. I think this room will be upgraded. I will tell you that the chairs are relatively new and much better than the chairs that were in here a year ago.
Meaning they don't squeak.
Meaning you can actually walk and you get up, where before they were a recipe for lower back pain. All right, so as I was starting to say, 2 things. First, I will pause, and I don't need to make it through my whole damn outline. I just wanted to have some organization to what I was going to say. But also, please interject if you've got a question, a comment, a disagreement. Just say it out loud. The next thing to know, there may be some false advertising in the title of this talk, and I don't know if there are Lincoln files in the audience, but I was kind of given a title, can I compare presidential leadership styles? And I thought, well, we're in the midst of the 100th anniversary of Lincoln. We've got another president from Illinois who's tall and skinny and governing a crisis. Why not compare the 2 of them? But the truth is, I'm not a historian of the presidency or political science who focuses on American politics per se. I do political philosophy. And I'm really interested in why American democracy is not working as well as it could and should be. And in particular, what is it that Obama might be doing if our institutions were functioning better? And I don't mean to put it all on Obama's shoulders. What our political system might be doing if it were functioning better. And so I thought that a good gambit would be to start out comparing Lincoln and Obama. And a quick question. I made available to the reunion organizers a short list of possible readings. Did anybody do the homework?
Some of it.
Some of it, okay. But so I'm not going to take for granted then the reading per se, because it looks like only a few of you had a chance to get to it. But I did, in a sense, frame a contrast, and I suggested that we look at the Gettysburg Address and a couple of Obama's recent speeches on the economy and inequality and mobility. And I'm going to just start there to start thinking about what Lincoln was able to do and what Obama has thought about doing that seems to not be as capable of doing. And the reason I point to the Gettysburg Address in particular, I guess it's two dimensions to it. And I'm drawing a lot on, I don't know if you know the book by Gary Willis, Lincoln at Gettysburg. It's a Pulitzer Prize-winning book. It's about 20 years old. It's excellent. And yeah, I don't think I put that on the suggested reading list, but the Wills points not just to the text and to all the formal and rhetorical dimensions of the text that make it such a powerful speech. And I do think in a sense, you know, the speech itself is a page long, right? The book is 300 pages long, right? And it repays that kind of attention in part because it is like poetry, not just in the sense that it's beautiful, but also in the sense that there's an awful lot going on in every line. But what I want to focus on, I think, is the opening line and the closing line. And these are familiar. Probably half of you could do it from memory, but I'm going to read it out to make sure I get it right. So, 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now, to us, I think that reads so familiar that it's impossible to detect the audacity in it. But it's similar to Jefferson's, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, which of course it echoes. That was not at all self-evident when Jefferson penned those words. And when Lincoln gave this address, it was not at all self-evident either that 77 years ago, which is 87 years, if I've got my math right, which means because the address was given in 1863, that Lincoln was pointing not to 1789, which is when most of his contemporaries would have dated the founding of America, but of course to 1776, and suggesting that Jefferson's text, more than the Constitution, was the true founding document of our society, and that the reason to do that, and you hear it then in this main body of that sentence, is to suggest that while this society is conceived in liberty, it is dedicated to equality, right? And that is changing the understanding of the Constitution and the framework that it sets up. And again, the audacity of this is that the Constitution is, as his audience is painfully aware, a slave charter, right? It's not dedicated to equality. And so he is reworking American culture, American ideology, American political institutions. The last one, he says, and there are not that many sentences, and part of the reason is because they are long. And I'm going to read the whole sentence, but I really want us to concentrate on the very last bit. He says, "It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth." Right? And what I really want to emphasize here is government of the people, by the people, for the people. And here Lincoln is being, in a sense, more honest in suggesting that that is a truly novel idea. there have been democracies, so-called, prior to America, though only a handful of them. But they were almost always democracies where the actual citizenship was a very small portion of the people, right? And where the leadership was mainly an elite within the elite of the citizens, right? The idea that government would not...
Albeit they were mostly still elected officials, elected leaders.
Yeah. But who could run, who could be elected, right? And the Greeks even did lottery. They didn't do elections. So there's variety, but the idea that it wouldn't just be of the people, but by the people and for the people is a radical idea. And again, Lincoln is reworking the inheritance of the American institutional system, the American Revolution. And of course, this address does not mention slavery. It does not mention the Civil War even, right? And in this sense, it's a work of abstraction and idealization, a work that says, let's forget about the details for a moment and think about the broader significance. And here I just want to quote one passage from Jerry Will's take on what Lincoln is doing in this address. He says the following. Words had to complete the work of guns. Lincoln is here not only to sweeten the air of Gettysburg, but to clear the infected atmosphere of American history itself, tainted with official sins and inherited guilt. He would cleanse the Constitution not as William Lloyd Garrison had by burning an instrument that countenanced slavery. He altered the document from within by appeal from its letter to the spirit, subtly changing the recalcitrant stuff of that legal compromise, bringing it to its own indictment. Lincoln had revolutionized the revolution, giving people a new past to live with that would change their future indefinitely. Right? So, reworking the Constitution, reworking the culture, this is an ambitious undertaking, right? And it's not this speech alone, but this speech is the crux of it, right? And it's the 13th Amendment. It is the work that Lincoln doesn't ultimately get to undertake himself, the 14th Amendment reconstruction, and then we know the sad history of it going off the rails pretty quickly thereafter. But I want to suggest, as opposed to dwelling on that historical moment, that the jurisprudence and the culture of the second half of the 20th century would not be possible but for Lincoln's understanding of the Constitution and the way in which Lincoln's understanding of the Constitution came to shape the official understanding of the Constitution that eventually led to decisions like Brown v. Board of Education or Roe v. Wade, or to legislation like the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, that in a sense, right, Lincoln's vision of the Constitution continues to inform the Constitution 100 plus years later. There's a question about whether 150 plus years later it still is as strong an influence. But that's the kind of audacity of Lincoln's undertaking in this speech and in the final years of his presidency. Pivoting now to Barack Obama. Obama has said repeatedly that either the most important or among the most important items on the agenda for his second term in office is addressing inequality, the decline of mobility, the hollowing out of the middle class. He's called us a bifurcated society, a society in which it is, oh boy, am I going to get the phrase? He has a very nice phrase for it. It's not quite win or lose society, but it's a society in which winners take all, and which those who don't win are left in a very marginal and vulnerable position, right? And so that's what he wants to do with the presidency, right? And then I highlighted two speeches that he gave, one in 2011, in a sense, inaugurating his second presidential campaign, and it was given in a town in Kansas where Teddy Roosevelt gave a famous progressive address, and it was meant to be a progressive stamp on the forthcoming presidential campaign. I don't think the presidential campaign actually worked out that way, but that's what he aimed to do. And then a speech from just last December in which he talked about mobility. And I have to be honest with you, I read both of these speeches, I don't find a single line that resonates in the way that every line of the Lincoln Gettysburg Address, or you could go through many of Lincoln's addresses, do. And I find a caution in Obama's rhetoric. I find what you might call a chastened president. He does not, I think, have the confidence that he can, through his rhetoric, change the culture, or also enact the policies that might actually change the society, right? And so he is very analytic. He's identifying the problem, and we can talk to various dimensions of it. He focuses on wages and income, and the fact that wages and income have actually gone down in this society for the average worker for the last 20, 25 years. Family income has stayed constant, but that's only because people are working more, and in particular because women have entered the labor force, right? And he focuses on the fact that though we like to think that we are the land of opportunity, it's not the case that if you're born poor in a European society, you have a greater chance of economic mobility than you do if you're born poor in America. Most Americans don't know that and don't want to think that about our society, but it is the truth. So he analyzes this, and then he calls for policy, he calls for legislation, but it's very tempered. It's very moderate. And I want to suggest in a moment pivot to the fact that I think this reflects, if you will, the institutional and political constraints with which he operates, and that he recognizes that even though he, I believe, speaks for a strong plurality or even majority of American voters and is addressing a real and heartfelt concern that affects the vast majority of American people, he's not going to be able to translate their discontent, their vulnerability, their frustration into effective policy, at least not unless something changes drastically. Note that the first speech in 2011, when he still had another election, so another chance to, in a sense, put his imprint on the political process, he's still very cautious in that address. And I want to suggest that reflects, if you will, what I'm calling diminished democracy and shrunken leadership in the United States today. And yes, please, I was going to stop now. George, yeah.
We live in France, and we see all this from considerable distance.
Right.
But one of the mysteries in Obama's speeches for us from a distance has been the difference, I'm sure this is common knowledge, between his rhetoric, which was remarkably inspiring, of the campaign, the first one in particular, and the performance. And I take it that the constraints factor that you just mentioned is critical in that. Why, I mean, beyond that, how could you reach such heights of rhetoric that are really inspiring in one case, and then not carry the movement of that over into the office? I can understand the constraints, of course, that's sort of obvious, but it's still a mystery to me. It's as though the man changed. I'm sure you're going to address that.
No, well, let me address it, but I want to pivot into the Constitution and the institutional framework. So good to give me a chance to say a little bit more about Obama before I do that. And I'll say two things here. I think that perhaps there was a sense in which the soaring rhetoric of the 2008 campaign did not accurately reflect the personality of Barack Obama. And that he's a gifted rhetorician who is able to evoke tremendous aspirations, but he's actually a quite cautious politician. And
he had any assistance in preparing that, or you think that really came out of his own spirit?
I think if you read his earlier autobiographical work, I imagine there's a staff there and he's getting some assistance, but he is himself a gifted rhetorician. I think there's no doubt about it. And one of the things that you get when you study Lincoln is the sense that Lincoln, in a sense, spent a whole life to get to the rhetorical pinnacle he was able to reach at Gettysburg. And I think also, in a sense, Barack Obama has been working on it for his whole life and is rhetorically very gifted. But I also think as a politician, he tends to be quite cautious. And so that there is a kind of mismatch there. But I think that,
if we look at the history of his first 100 days in office, he was aggressive, he was rigorous, but it wasn't publicized.
Yeah.
And he's not a bragger, he's not a boaster.
Yeah.
And what he does is substantive. However, his marketing team didn't really do a good job.
Yeah.
And I think simultaneously, the constraints of the Congress started bearing down on him, and somewhere in there he shifted to try to keep compromising to effect change and trying to find that place. And from what I have been able to see, the typical American strategy is to change the rules on you so that you don't ever figure it out.
Yeah.
And being a person of African American heritage, I've studied that psychology that has been America's strength, if you want to call it that.
Yeah.
And I think the master play we have seen unfold in this. With this administration.
Good, thank you. And what's your name?
I'm sorry, I'm Bonnie Claire Smith Stewart, 69.
Hi. Have we met once before? Hey, we have, right?
I think so.
Yeah. Okay. So Bonnie's point, and I don't know if you were when I said Georgia, I'll make 2 points.
Okay.
And you're very much making the same point I wanted to make as well, which is, and let me be a little bit more detailed. So George Packard, who writes for the New Yorker and wrote a long biographical sketch in December, January, but also wrote a book on Obama, I think illuminates this very nicely. And what he emphasizes is that Obama in 2008 campaigned on the promise of being a transformative president, right? And in particular of pushing us beyond a highly polarized partisan political climate and trying to undo some of the dysfunction that comes out of treating every issue of policy in order to maximize partisan advantage out of it, right? And on the one hand, he had a very ambitious political agenda, and that political agenda was a fairly traditional democratic semi-left agenda, right? And on the other hand, he, as a constitutional scholar and a politician, was very interested in process issues. How do I involve the other side? And I think if you look at the way he approached his signature legislation, healthcare, or if you look at the way he approached the bailout legislation, and the stimulus legislation, he was initially trying to involve the Republicans as co-authors of his agenda. And they didn't take the bait, right? They were not at all interested in doing that. And so I think part of what you see very reluctantly from Obama is a kind of two-pronged strategy. On the one hand, use whatever partisan and institutional tools are available to get what you can get done. And on the other hand, in a sense, try to set a tone that makes it possible for there to be a post-partisan settlement at some point in the future, right? Someone in that article referred to him as the John the Baptist president. He's laying the grounds for whoever comes next or after that. In terms of the first prong, right, get done what you can get done given the constraints, I think it's worthwhile noting all of the major legislative accomplishments that anybody's going to pay any attention to with Obama's presidency. And that's not the only thing you judge a presidency by. Right? How much legislation gets passed is one yardstick. They all occurred in 19 months. They occurred from the time that Al Franken finally had his votes tallied and got to the Senate, and the time that Kennedy died. And that's the time that there's a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate. And so I don't know about changing the rules, but using the rules in everywhere possible to thwart his legislative agenda. It was very clear, and I cite in this suggestion for further readings this book by Jacob Hacker and Paul Pearson, Winner Take All Politics, and they point out in very convincing detail that from Jimmy Carter forward, there's been an effort every time a Democratic president has been elected to do everything that can be done to use the rules, especially the Senate, which have very complicated procedural rules, including the filibuster, to block as much of that agenda as possible. And I do think that it's fair to say that that happened. In the article, Packer quotes Obama at a fundraiser in Los Angeles where he's being pushed. Use executive power. The particular issue is deportation and immigration reform. And Obama says, I think very revealingly, that there is, let's see if I can get it right, no shortcut to politics, no shortcut to democracy. And this is his way of saying, I'm not going to abuse executive power to violate the law, despite the fact that that's what I think is just and right, and might give my party a partisan advantage. And I do think that's that kind of long ball game that Obama is playing, which is to say, despite the fact that the other side is manipulating the institutional framework by, the rules of the game to thwart him, he's not going to he's not going to return their fire in the same way because he thinks it's unfair, unconstitutional, wrong, and so he is trying to set a tone even though he recognizes that tone won't actually change the culture of Washington anytime soon. Again, I think that makes for an interesting study of contrast with Lincoln, who gives this address, I think, quite confident that he can make the meaning of the Civil War by the power of his rhetoric. Yeah.
Two things that pops to mind. One is, if I remember the history correctly, Lincoln thought that the speech he gave was terrible, which if I remember correctly, because there was someone who had gone before him who had spoken forever, and there was an initial reaction, sort of very quickly, of this was not a good speech, and that immediately overtaken in a couple of months to be that it wasn't a good speech. The more substantive thing, and the point that I think what's interesting about Obama is that he also seems to, in a very funny way, because he has such an appreciation for process and such an appreciation for history. This is not to bring in politics to a philosophical discussion, but three of the last four Democratic presidents suffered pretty substantive body blows due to their pushing of serious health care reform. LBJ, pushes for Medicare, and then suffers for it, though he suffers more for Vietnam.
Or civil rights.
And civil rights as well.
Yeah.
Carter doesn't really go too close to it. Clinton, there's an article in the New York, not this most recent one, the one before that, a big portion of it talks about how Hillary's continued anger towards the media has a bit to do with how badly she was treated for that. So,
right.
You look at you made a very good point, you look at sort of the first couple months, first year and a half or so of Obama's presidency, and And he's got a lot of big issues on his table. He's got immigration reform, climate change, you know, a series of different types of economic investments, and he chooses, and this is not said right or wrong, but he chooses them to go for very serious healthcare reform,
Right.
which is something that the Republicans have shown for the last 60 or so years that they're pretty good at marshaling people against.
Yeah, so on your first point first, very quickly, Edward Everett spoke for over 2 hours before Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address. And by the way, Lincoln's role was not as the main speaker. He was only there to dedicate the memorial. If I've got it right, Lincoln knew that he wrote a very good speech. The question was whether he gave a very good speech. And then, there's some indication that between his depression and his tendency to self-criticism, he wasn't the best judge of whether he gave a good speech. But I think he knew, and if you look at the reports in the papers of the day, which I'm not a historian of this, I'm relying on other historians, that pretty quickly it was appreciated. This was a significant and powerful speech.
I would think that if following on a 2-hour speech, anything he said
But you know, let me take your joke and make a serious point out of it, and then I'll apologize for being serious all the time. But one of the things I would say that perhaps differentiates a little bit the middle of the 19th and the beginning of the 21st century is the fact that people expected to sit out in the hot sun with flies and horseflies buzzing around them, and I guess it wasn't hot, it was November, but that when people did go to hear Frederick Douglass or Emerson or Thoreau speak, they paid good money to sit in the sun or under a tent for 2.5 hours and to hear what I think to us would sound like a very pedantic and convoluted address. And so I want to use the phrase the public sphere. The public sphere at the middle of the 19th century is a different public sphere from the beginning of the 21st century, and that in part informs why Everett thought he could get away with it, and actually was, you know, he's the president of Harvard, he's well known for giving these kinds of addresses. They knew what they were doing when they invited him. On your second point, and by the way, tell me your name? Kate? Yeah, okay. Obama made choices, and I do think that there may have been a double miscalculation on his part and the part of the people who surrounded him, which on the one hand, the idea that he had just won an election handily on the basis of this idea of being a post-partisan president would get him more capital and more cooperation with the Republicans. And I think that was a clear miscalculation. The second question is what the priorities should be and how much they can get done. I don't think he obviously anticipated that Ted Kennedy would die. I don't think he anticipated that the 2010 elections would go as badly against him as they did. I think that he misjudged the process issues around healthcare, which very quickly made it seem like less of a victory and more of a compromise by the time it was passed. Having said all of that, I do think that this is the most significant extension of the New Deal or social welfare state since the Great Society work of LBJ. And that's not just in and of itself an accomplishment. That Obama, in a sense, did have one eye on justice and one eye on partisan advantage in the future. And the eye on justice is, you know, this is a basic right in most other societies. And there are a lot of people who suffer both physical pain and disease and also a great deal of psychological distress when they don't have adequate health care. But it's also the case that the majority beneficiaries of this policy would be the poor, obviously, but also especially Latinos and also African Americans. And that he had an eye on the changing demographics of American society, and the idea that once this policy was passed and people began to benefit from them, in a sense you get the same dynamic that you got with the New Deal, which is it becomes, quote, a third rail. You can't touch it, right? And that helps to build a coalition of people who see government as potentially protecting them against the vicissitudes of the capitalist economy, right?
And so you can't leave out the whole umbrella of human rights, I think, which also includes the gay and lesbian community as well.
Yeah.
And also included the disabled.
Good. Yeah.
I mean, this huge umbrella of humanity that he brought with that message was.
Excuse me, I didn't get the feeling that the movement towards greater equality for gay and lesbian was something that was his champion, that he was.
No, but they read into it, just like he didn't get up and say, I'm going to do this for African Americans.
But I kind of thought it was Biden opening his mouth and pushing him into saying, okay, I'm doing it. No, I'm serious.
I hear you.
Yeah.
You know, not.
And I mean, so I didn't want to spend the whole time talking about Obama, but I'll just say one thing here. There's interesting pivots in Obama's career. So many of us have been thinking about the NSA and surveillance, and if you look at Obama in 2004, he's incredibly critical of the Patriot Act, right? And even as a candidate in 2008, he's quite critical of it. As a president, he obviously did nothing to roll it back until Snowden and others made it impossible for us for the NSA to continue its so-called metadata program. But I mean, just tremendous surveillance on all of our communications. I think the same thing is true with marriage equality. That if you look at him in 2004, he's firmly in favor of it, but he makes an adjustment in 2008 because he's a candidate for the presidency and he doesn't think he can get elected. I do think you're right that Biden forced his hand, but that in a sense he forced him to probably return to where he was already, and that it was probably a good thing because frankly I do think that gay, lesbian, political activists were beginning to lose patience.
You know, more cynical people say, well, gay and lesbians tend to have more money, and so they're. I'm serious. You know.
Or will
so
always vote
included.
Democratic,
Right.
so why do we use
Right. So that's included.
All right. So yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Is George Hobson here?
Yes, he's.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're back. I was wondering about what happened.
Thank you.
That's okay. I thought you were just stopping by to listen.
I would love to take the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so I want to pivot now to thinking about the relationship between the chastened tone that seems to be reflected in Obama's addresses and the institutional context in which he operates. And so especially the constitutional framework of American government and whether or not this 18th century framework actually works in the 21st century. And I know most of you didn't read it. I suggested a couple of articles. One of them, many of you may know Jeffrey Toobin, who writes a lot for the New Yorker, and he wrote an article in December, Our Broken Constitution. And the punchline of his article, if you will, is that though there are a bunch of scholars on the left and the right who think the Constitution is broken, it's actually not. And that, in essence, the Constitution is more or less what the people make of it. And he particularly addresses the problem of the obstacles to amendment. When you look at Article 5, it requires 2/3 approval of both Congress and the Senate, and then 3/4 approval of the states. And in particular, the disproportionate representation in the Senate. Any state delegation can veto any effort to change that. So all it takes is 2 senators from one state to defeat any effort to reform the Senate to make it more representative. And Tubin says, yes, there are real obstacles to amending the Constitution. And many constitutional scholars think that essentially the era of amendment has probably passed, or at least the era of substantive amendment, like the 14th Amendment. We may have technical amendments, but nothing major. And Tubin says, well, wait a minute. If you look at the Constitution, yes, it's sometimes formally amended, but much more often, actually, it is changed via the interpretive activity of judges, especially on the Supreme Court. And that this is, if you will, where democratic constitutional politics can change the Constitution.
Or
not. And can change it via both the appointment process and also just via changes in political climate to make it clear to the justices that the court will lose its legitimacy if they don't fall in line with a wellspring of popular opinion on an issue. And some of you may remember Andrew Jackson's famous quip, was it Justice Marshall he was talking to? Justice Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it, right? The Supreme Court as an institution has no power other than the power that stems from its legitimacy, right? And so that's a precious commodity that they have to tend, and they can only swim so hard against the current of public opinion without undermining their legitimacy. And clearly there are justices like Scalia and Alito who kind of say, public opinion began. But so far they're in a powerful minority because there are justices like Roberts and Kennedy who say, even I think Roberts basically agrees with almost anything that Alito and Scalia say, but he's not willing to go as fast as they want to go, right? In order to preserve the legitimacy of the Constitution, Tubin is in a sense asking, what if we became more active as a people in thinking about our Constitution and actually trying to influence the way in which the court reads it? Couldn't we change the Constitution that way?
Well, that would come of the people, by the people, by the corporation, for the corporation, right?
Yeah. And so, and now, once again, I'll turn your quip into a serious remark. That's more or less Francis Fukuyama's line. And so Fukuyama, I think, is the pessimist here. Did anyone know Francis Fukuyama before?
Did he write The End of History? Or?
Exactly, End of History and the Last Man. And so The End of History and the Last Man, which was published in the mid-90s, is a neoconservative classic. And at that point, Fukuyama had come off of working for Reagan and the first Bush, and gone to Stanford where he works at the Hoover Institute, and he had all his conservative credentials in order. And he wrote this book, which actually played a pretty large role in the second Bush's decision that he could remake the Middle East via invasion.
The End of History and
The Last Man.
the last one.
Yeah, so The End of History is Hegel's phrase, The Last Man is Nietzsche's phrase, and the thesis of the book essentially is that after the Cold War, there is no alternative to liberal capitalism, that the U.S. model has won. And it was, I think, very important in then suggesting that the Iraqis would greet us with open arms after we invaded, because we were just bringing them into the 21st century, right?
I find conspicuously that we left out the Congress, that part of the government, but they're pretty much ineffective now. So without the three branches of the government working, there's not much that can happen. Even if the Supreme Court makes a decision, the legislation to enforce it comes from, and it's ineffective. And Obama can't get anything done because it's ineffective. So.
Yeah, no, that's exactly where I want to go.
Okay, good.
Yeah, go ahead.
We really have not said those three words, constitutional reform, or no, electoral reform.
Right.
That's what we almost got there about 20 years ago. Huge movement towards it. We're all going to be charged $1, which are going to be distributed to the people, and it just went.
Right. And not only that.
I mean, the fact that we're actually inviting corporate America or wealthy America or whatever what finger pointing you want to do this. I mean, it's asinine.
Yeah.
In my opinion.
Were you going to say something, Minute?
No,
Oh.
but the thought that free speech is defined by money is such a crazy.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and so everybody's heard of Citizens United, I assume, right? Have you heard of McCutcheon versus FEC yet? Right, so there's a decision that was just handed down a couple months ago that, if I've got it right, is actually much more destructive of campaign finance reform, which I think is different from electoral reform.
Right.
McCutcheon, I think, is both going to open the door to direct partisan contributions in a way that, the previous maximum had been around 70,000. If the calculation I've seen is correct, the new maximum is going to be around 13 million. So, I mean, it's just a vast opening of the floodgates of money into the parties and the candidates themselves. And if I've got it right, the doctrine of that decision actually suggests that almost no other limits can be put in place compatible with the First Amendment. I definitely want to talk about both the legislature and money in politics. I think, you can't understand why American democracy is so dysfunctional without understanding those two aspects.
Because of the law.
Yeah,
somewhat. That's not all of it.
Yeah, and Fukuyama points out that lobbying right now is a multi-billion-dollar a year industry, and so I think we're getting to the point where it's upwards of $10 billion a year that's being spent to influence the American political process. And the other thing that's really, I think, distressing about the McCutcheon decision is it changes the definition of corruption, or I should say it disambiguates it. In the original Buckley v. Vallejo decision, there's ambiguity as to whether or not corruption literally means I'm going to give you a bag of money for passing this legislation or writing this regulation, or does it mean corrupting the process such that people no longer can have confidence that their vote counts equally with everybody else's vote. And what Roberts did in the McCutcheon decision is to say corruption is only the quid pro quo form. And the dissent, I think, was very clear in saying that's ludicrous. And what Francis Fukuyama puts out in his article is that this is a deeply corrupt political process right now. And I'm kind of all over the place, which is good because you're forming me there. Let me say one more thing about this, and then I'll come to you. I point you to a couple of different sources. Larry Bartels under point 5a, and on the back, I think I also put Martin Gillen's, an article he co-authored with Benjamin Page. These are political scientists who study the responsiveness of the American political system to different sections of the American electorate, and they divide the electorate in terms of wealth. And their finding, to simplify it a little bit when they converge on this finding, is that if you're in the top 10% of American society, there is a positive correlation between what you want out of politics and what legislatures tend to believe and the kind of legislation that gets passed. If you're in the next 60%, so the vast middle of the society, no correlation whatsoever. And if you're in the bottom 30%, negative correlation. What you want is actually predictive of what isn't going to happen in Washington or in legislative politics. And so, yeah, we're at a point now where money deeply corrupts the political process, but the Supreme Court has an understanding of corruption that prevents them from doing anything about it.
And there's very recently a really interesting opinion piece by Lynn Greenhouse, who was
Mhm.
so long
Yeah.
Times reporter from the Supreme Court, and she was saying that she was suggesting that the Supreme Court is now setting the trends, setting the opinions. They've become a political body themselves. You know, she was also referring to what was horrifying to me was the decision about the religious prayer in the little town hall business, because that just, and then also the Voting Rights Act decision.
Oh, yeah.
And when you say, well, the government isn't broken, the Constitution isn't broken down, it's sort of where is Congress? And I think also, this is just me, I don't understand why there's no outrage response by other than Al Franken,
Right.
Yeah. Because these are things that are, all these things are
Yeah.
just there.
Well, and maybe
Yes.
Eric Holder, if we're talking about what, on the one hand, the Supreme Court did to the Voting Rights Act, and then what immediately following in its wake, Texas and Mississippi and other states are doing, and to be clear, I haven't talked a lot about race here, right? And so I've been talking a little bit about inequality and about Obama's desire to change inequality. When he talks about inequality in these speeches, he talks almost exclusively about economic inequality. I suggested a very, I think, impressive article in the Atlantic Monthly as well. It just came out and again is getting a lot of attention. It's by Ta-Nehisi Coates, and it's on reparations for slavery. But
There's a definite buzz.
yeah. And I mean, to be honest with you, as someone who studies and teaches this stuff, there's not a lot that's original in his article, but it's a fabulous synthesis of a lot of literature on how racial inequality persists in the United States despite formal legal equality. And so, that's obviously what Lincoln was concerned with. And there's a sense in which, whether we look at the wealth gap, which is 20 to 1. So if you're from a white family, the average white family has 20 times more wealth than the average black family. Or if we're looking at school segregation, where the schools are now every bit as segregated as they were prior to Brown v. Board, and the expenditure per student in many districts is as bad as it was under separate but equal in terms of the racial divisions. Or you look at healthcare or educational achievement, there's just a gaping racial divide in the society. And the Republicans in these states, rather than trying to reach out to Latinos and blacks and Asians, and they're doing terribly in terms of elections with those three groups, and they see the writing on the wall. You heard this comedian whose act is called Waiting for 2042, right? Who will become a so-called majority-minority society. But rather than trying to reach out to those groups and to make what they have to say palatable or actually responsive to them, they're trying to disenfranchise. And I agree that it's not that there's an outrage, but I think there's a lack of confidence that the political system, that political institutions, that political leaders can actually be effective change agents. And so that, to me, is the real scandal here. It's that people who are outraged don't know what to do with their outrage.
Is that partially a function of the media system now we have, the shortest attention span, and the internet?
Yeah.
It breaks everything up into so many little pieces, nobody gets together.
imagine Edward Everett giving a 2+ hour address at a national ceremony today, right? Nobody, not even CNN, right, would cover it. Maybe C-SPAN.
Well, I know we're not letting you.
No, it's fine. This is what it should be.
But when Obama first ran, it was so thrilling for those of us who
Right.
were oriented towards racial justice, like the new world had come, and maybe I used to look at the cover of Time and stuff and think, oh, the Kennedys and stuff, or the glamour, that they're really like movie stars, and maybe Obama and Michelle were so attractive. Maybe they were like movie stars or sports heroes, entertainers, and so we could vote for a black person, but that really didn't mean that maybe we were voting for a celebrity,
right.
potential celebrity, but it didn't mean we were voting for a new era, or some,
just going off of the sheet, a couple months before the Case for Reparations article came out, Ta-Nehisi Coates and Jonathan Chait, who's a political writer for New York Magazine, had a really, and these are two very rigorous, they're not the sort of standard pundits, they're very, very rigorous in their articles. They have a lot of great information and really have as much evidence as they can. They got into this really great to read, because they're both so rigorous, debate with Coates arguing that Obama hasn't been that great, and Chait arguing, Chait was that sort of dumpy Jewish guy arguing that he had.
Right.
And it was this phenomenal sort of...
And great meaning great for African Americans, or great...
Great both in terms of inequality and for African Americans
right.
specifically. And it was this very, I think, telling moment, because these are two individuals who are not considered anything but very, very progressive.
Yeah.
And so you move away from sort of the drudgery of the punditry, sort of the high cream of it, and still within the progressive movement, no one really is sure of. Right, exactly.
Yeah, and I'm inclined to think, and sort of come back to the original comment, right? Let me give a little historical background, right? So the Voting Rights Act passes in 1965. RFK says when it passes that within a generation an African American can be president, right? And Richard Wright, writing at the time, says that he wishes the rest of America could have heard the derisive laughter with which that comment was greeted in Harlem, right? Because nobody in Harlem thought that this represented anything but an important game, but a formal game, right? And lo and behold, RFK was actually a little pessimistic. It was less than a generation before we have an African American president.
That's because when you look at history, and getting back to your point about the Supreme Court, when we look at significant cases that relate to gender bias and racial bias, the Supreme Court really has been very consistent in their performance. And if we had not had a Warren, then some things may have been different. If we had not had world coverage media, then 1964 may not have happened.
Right.
So
And we
African
wouldn't have
Americans
had
weren't all that
no
excited because nothing was ever done out of the heart of America as a humane act. There were always force. And then there's all this back and forth. You have the civil rights of 1875, and then then it's retracted. It's like, you're free but you're not free, you're equal but you're not equal. You're a woman but we really want you, pregnant, barefoot in the kitchen. And so as far as gender and race are concerned, America really has been very consistent. And I don't know why we're surprised.
Well, so let me say three things that are, I think, not necessarily all entirely consistent. One is that I do think that the fact that in 2008 America voted for an African American president is a real watershed and a measure of incredible progress on the part of the vast majority of the American electorate. The the second thing I would say is that I think, I don't know about the verdict on the Obama presidency as a whole, but if you look at the social situation of the average African American, now 6 years into the Obama presidency, it has gotten worse, not better, under Obama. Now that I don't think he's at fault, but I think he hasn't been able to do much. And the one exception here would be the healthcare reform and the way in which the healthcare reform is targeted to poor, and there's a great deal of overlap, of course, between race and poverty in our society. One more thing I would say is that then I think we're at a place in American society where at least a significant fraction of the average white voter will vote for a black president who seems to be, what did Joe Biden say, clean and articulate, right? You know, you can get the subtext there, right? But that doesn't mean that they're willing to surrender their white privilege, if you will, right? And that's what I think.
That's always been the issue.
Yeah.
You know, that's always been the issue from the beginning. With every move that we see that looks like progress, there's this.
And that would be incredibly costly. Let me just give you a little factoid here. I brought a speaker to campus a few years ago who was studying the movement to allow people, when they fill out the census form, to check more than one box. You don't have to just be one racial group, right? The people who spearheaded that movement were white women in interracial relationships because they didn't want to have to say that their children were either African American or white. It wasn't credible to say they were white the way race works in America, but they didn't want them to have to completely surrender their white inheritance. And I do think that speaks a lot to these kinds of issues.
I do want to say that just in the weeks before, the months before the 2008 election, when the polls looked good for Obama, many people felt that people would go into it, that that's just when people were telling polls,
right,
and that they would go into the voting booth and they would vote against Obama. And it turned out to be the reverse was true, that many people who wouldn't admit they were voting for him were going into the polling booth and voting for him. But I think given that being said, that no one could have predicted the kind of backlash against him that occurred, because, you know, especially in Congress and Southern.
And the whole so-called birther movement, I think,
That's
it's hard to read without saying these are people who cannot accept that there could be a legitimate African American president of the United States. By the way, when political scientists try to measure this, and I think it's an imprecise art, not a science, but they suggest that probably at least 5% of the American population voted against Obama because he's black. And I shouldn't say 5% of the American population, 5% of the white electorate.
I read somewhere also, and I was talking to a cousin of mine, and I was saying something about Obama being the first black president. She said, oh, a cousin of mine supports him and writes him at least once a week. Said, oh, but he's not black. And I thought, wow, you know, and he said, no, she said he has a white mother.
Yeah.
That was kind of
Yeah, no, you hear comments like that. Okay. Did you want to?
I was say something I think we can't take out of the equation is people's crazy and irrational fear that is just always present. Right before the first Obama election, I was on my way to pick up my daughter at Girl Scouts and listening to NPR, and they had this little group that they gathered in someplace in Pennsylvania. I want to say York, Pennsylvania. And they're talking about the election and what they're going to do, and the subject of race comes up. And you can tell they've been together for a while, and they've gotten comfortable with each other, and they've forgotten they're on the radio. You know, they don't really remember that anymore. And this woman who speaks out and says, here's why I can't vote for him, because here's what I think will happen. If he's elected, all of the black people will become so full of themselves that they'll be so angry and they'll think they've taken over, and they'll like push us off the sidewalks when they pass us. And I thought, that's the craziest thing you've ever heard, right? And then as the conversation circles around, casually the NPR reporter who's in the room mentions the fact that she's African American, and does that affect how they perceive her? And I thought, oh my God, like it's bad enough that they think these things to start with. They say them out loud. They say them anywhere at all, but they said it in front of and to the face of a woman of the group there.
Do you recall how they responded to the reporter when she asked them that?
She kept her reporter hat on the whole time. I mean, she asked questions with no push or pull, and I think they sort of said, well, you're not the president, so it doesn't affect, like, we don't think you'll push us off the sidewalk. And then I went to Girl Scouts where my two friends were, and I said, you guys just promise me you won't push me off the sidewalk after the election. And they don't.
I've known somebody for about a year and a half. This guy writes some incredible articles for local paper. And I agree with his thinking, all of that. But all of a sudden the other day, I found out something about him I hadn't realized before, in terms of his racial, ethnic, religious background. And my God, suddenly I found myself, I had to stop. I was thinking about it differently. Even though intellectually, I say that shouldn't matter. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
I've got to, we have to work hard to repress that, I think.
Just the flip side of what you're saying, though, I wish we had more honest and open dialogue.
Oh, yeah.
Instead of having it's not a problem.
Yeah, and not talking about it. And so, I don't know.
So in a minute, I want to say something about post-racial, but you've been
I
waiting
was
for a
gonna
very
say-
long time, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say that I think it's been implied that another element to the equation is the radical right. We don't usually use the term radical or the right, but they're extreme, and the people I'm talking about anyway, and they'll disenfranchise anyone who isn't them.
Yeah.
And that's, the intolerance, I think that really contributes. One of the factors.
That's an interesting thing relative to, gay rights is what's happening with women and abortions and stuff. That's a whole other group that's,
So
that radical right that's spoken about.
when
Abortions.
we look at the decision that gutted part of the Voting Rights Act, right? So it's not the whole thing's gone, and in a sense, the interesting strategy that Eric Holder, the Attorney General for Obama, who apparently stayed on for precisely this reason, is taking is to use what remains of the Voting Rights Act to try to fight against the disenfranchisement or efforts to pass voting ID laws, to constrict the hours that voting takes place, to change the places, all in ways that are, I think, objectively going to make it more difficult for people with less money, less security, the kind of job that you can't take time off from, right? You got to take a bus as opposed to a car. If you look suspect, right, and obviously that's a racially charged judgment in our society, it's going to make it more difficult for those kinds of people to vote. This is happening, and there is an effort to push back, and that effort will have to go through the very same court system that gutted the Voting Rights Act to begin with. Why was the Voting Rights Act gutted? It was gutted because John Roberts, again, who wrote the decision, suggested that the South is no longer the South of 1965. And the implication was that it's not as racist as it was. And I think there's a sense in which that's absolutely true. And that it's important to note the way in which it's true. And so the kind of racism that was prevalent in the South in the 1950s and 1960s was vitriolic, hateful racism, right? And there may be some of that still in certain segments of the population.
It was also out in the open.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
But we forget about the riots that happened across the country. We forget that at the Union League Club in New York, the wait staff and the servants had separate quarters. They had separate bathrooms. And this was at the Union League Club that broke out of the Union Club.
Yeah.
And, you know, this riding the South, I'm from the South, and so much of it is true, but, you know, it's a smokescreen for what the real issues are across the nation.
Right, and so, given all the remarkable information that Coates synthesizes in that Atlantic Monthly article, which I strongly recommend to you if you want, just kind of to be able to marshal all your resources about where the fact of social inequality comes from, I think it's impossible to maintain that race doesn't matter for social standing and social fate in our society. Not that really you should need that much evidence, because it should be pretty obvious. But this whole idea that the best way to combat racism is to stop paying attention to race, the so-called racial blind ideology, is, in a sense, taking away the toolkit that we need to be able to do the analysis, to begin to be able to generate policies, to begin to be able to address the problem. And so I think part of the real problem here is that there is a credible ideology of being non-racist and post-racial, and being post-racial because you're non-racist, that gives cover to this kind of jurisprudence in politics. And that Obama has been, again, constrained by the climate of American politics. I thought the address he gave on race in 2007 at the Philadelphia Constitutional Center is, in a sense, his Gettysburg Address. It's probably the most powerful single address he's given, and it was incredibly balanced, but I thought honest. But as president, he hasn't been able to do that, right? And for him, that was kind of putting race behind it.
What happened with the Gates thing in Cambridge?
Yes.
Fear.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One little last comment. If anyone is interested in having or creating an informal platform for this kind of discussion, there is a documentary that was done by the Brown family, and the DeWolfs. She found out she was a descendant of the DeWolfs, who were the single largest slave-holding family in the United States and Rhode Island. So she went on a mission, and the documentary is tracing the trades. And if you just show the documentary, the discussion will follow. It's fabulous. And they made the mistake and sent me the commercial instead of the residential version. The commercial version has so much more aftermath with discussion. And so if you have the opportunity,
What's it called?
Tracing the Trades.
Which version would you get?
If you can get the commercial version, because it has all of this wonderful extra dialogue. Yes.
So, thank you for that, and I am looking for those kinds of things now. I can see whether we have it here or not.
It's real. It's open, and it's the emotions that are out of 200 people in the family. I think none of you are interested, and went on this excursion, the triangle of tracing the trades with the family, and it's
Great.
Thanks.
So, we've gone all over the map, and that's fine with me. How much time, when do we let out here?
Well, typically 3:30 is like the official end, but nobody's going to kick you out, so you are welcome to stay and talk until you can't.
I have a question for you.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
We know that gender bias came with patriarchal society. In your opinion, where did the issue of race become implanted in the United States?
In the United States. Well, I guess I would go back to Portugal, and then England and Spain and the slave trade. And so there's an idea of race that predates
Jamestown.
colonization even, and the slave trade in its modern form.
You have to say that the minute they arrived and there were Native Americans who were the other to them,
Right.
were us.
Well, you
and
had
they're them.
indentured slavery, then chattel slavery came.
Yeah,
So.
yeah, and indentured slaves or servants were typically white, whereas chattel slavery was African, right? And I think it's impossible to separate the American or really the modern idea of race from the institution of slavery. And so when you look at the idea of race in the way that it figures prior to the slave trade, it's very much like the idea of culture. And so you have English people referring to the Irish race and talking about the fact that Irish people have a different language and write poetry in different ways and have a different kind of music, and that's all part of their race, right?
And the Scots as well.
Oh, of course. But that's just to illustrate this looser pre-slave trade use of the term race. And then you get chattel slavery. And one of the things that distinguishes modern chattel slavery even from ancient slavery is the idea that the category of being a slave is one that is inescapable and heritable. There's no manumission, there's nothing you can do to earn your freedom, and the descendant of the slave is going to be a slave, right? And that gives then, presents a tremendous puzzle to European Enlightenment thought, which is increasingly dedicated to the idea of equality, of freedom, of reason. How can we reconcile, right, the idea that all humans are free and equal, as John Locke famously put it, and yet that we own some people as property and that their descendants will also be our property. And the way to do it is to suggest that there is some differential category within humanity or a subgroup of humanity that disqualifies them from what we would now call human rights. And race evolved to play that role, right? And so this idea that a person who has, right, one drop of African American blood is black in the way that it's written in American law is a direct product of that way of thinking about race. And I don't think you can separate it from the slave trade. And so
I don't either.
That's where, in my mind,
Yeah, and so now DNA is proving that everybody has a drop.
Yeah,
So,
exactly. Yeah,
Can you remind me of the Dred Scott, what the Dred Scott issue is? Does that make anything to you?
yeah, of course.
I mean, can you remind me what the form of it was?
yeah.
You want to go?
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I get excited.
No, please,
Your
go ahead.
stage. No, I'm sorry.
It's not my stage. It's a Sarah Lawrence roundtable. Okay, so does anyone remember the year 1857? Right. And this is perhaps the most infamous Supreme Court decision, the one that they're most ashamed of. And it essentially suggested that African Americans are property and not entitled to equality under the law.
The way they got around it was saying that you should have applied for your freedom when you were in a free state.
Yeah. And so it was instrumental in the so-called enforcement of the so-called Fugitive Slave Act, which, if you've seen 12 Years a Slave, you know was a source of tremendous insecurity for African American citizens of northern states because they could be at any point grabbed up and taken to the South under that act. And it's just incredible distortion of American political values. And on the other hand, even in saying that, I guess I have to say I'm looking at it retrospectively from the perspective that we can help this to create, probably from the perspective of 1857 and it represents. Yeah, and then I'll come to you.
So that's one thing we haven't discussed, and then is this resurgence of this resurgence of the notion of states' rights, and then that these things should be different, not one country united by common values, principles of equality. Where you live
marriage, and we had the health care reform before, and I think giving the states power is really interesting. But what I was going to say, and I don't mean to evoke that it's a similar thing, but when you said, you know, anybody who has a drop of African American blood is African American, it made me think of Hitler, right? You know?
Yeah.
And we're lucky that we didn't have somebody like Hitler here to take that statement like he did, and with the Jews and Africans and gay people and lesbians and yeah.
There's this really silly debate that some people sometimes engage in, which is, you know, which is worse, American slavery or the Holocaust? And you know, I mean, I'm not sure why we need to quantify and rank. Right.
We didn't slaughter 8 million people. I'm not even separating out the Jews from the other people, because there were 6 million Jews and 2 million whatever, all kinds of.
I think if you were to try to quantify the deaths in the slave trade, you would find that they number in the millions.
Really?
Yeah, sure. The passage, just the sheer transportation of people from Africa to North America probably killed millions of people because of the conditions.
Right.
Gilroy's book is excellent on
Yeah.
the Atlantic.
Yeah.
Gilroy.
Well, it's just a short life term than once they got here.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, we came to place a value, an economic, not a moral value, on the life of the slave and their capacity to procreate. If you look at what happened in Haiti, for instance, right? You know, they just worked people to death and then brought more people in. So, we could talk about another factor. The Nazis, for the most part, didn't rape, right? Rape was a systematic part of slavery, right? And you can.
Well, they show that in filters.
Yeah, and I'm thinking, and I'm not getting the name. There's the narrative that Toni Morrison's Beloved is based on of the killing of the child by the African American slave mom. Right? There are a lot of, apparently that's a pretty typical case, or at least it's not an unusual thing that many African Americans kill their own children rather than letting them lead the life of a child slave. And so, you know, I mean, again, I don't want to engage in the comparison thing because I think it's silly, but I do think that one thing you could say is that these are two of the most horrific institutions or episodes of human history.
The fact that it's so common that we know of 2 presidents of the United States that had very public, Jefferson and Polk both had very public.
Right.
Polk has no direct descendants except for with the slave descendants.
Yeah.
He's got a bunch of nieces and nephews on one side, but there's no direct one to him except through that side.
So let me switch from this happy subject to another unhappy subject, and that is to say, so we've talked a lot about race, we've talked a little bit about gender, we've talked a fair bit about economic and social inequality as well, and then take it back to the fact that we have African American president from relatively modest means who said his top priority for his second term is addressing inequality, and then the very modest rhetoric and the even more modest legislative agenda he's pursuing along these lines. And the kind of takeaway question I want to pose is, in a sense, and sorry because I know you haven't read Fukuyama, most of you, but is Tubin right or is Fukuyama right? And what Tubin is suggesting is we can fix this Constitution if we put our minds to it, and Fukuyama is making the much more pessimistic suggestion that no, not only can we not stop the perpetual tendency of American politics, which is for small groups of powerful actors with vested interests to use the many places in the institutional framework where it's possible to block legislation, right? Fukuyama refers to America as having a veto-ocracy, right? So the book by Hacker and Pearson on winner take all politics calls this the politics of drift. That many corporate actors, many powerful social actors recognize that all they have to do to protect their interests is keep legislation frozen while what they're doing changes, which is effectively deregulating what's happening in their sector of the economy or with regard to their interests. And so Fukuyama suggests the only way that we could effectively mitigate the degree of inequality and many other inefficiencies in our society, and by the way, I threw global climate change in there just to suggest it's not only social issues that in a sense benefit some groups at the cost of other groups, it's also, if you will, humanitarian issues, because we're all in trouble if we don't do something to arrest the process that's already underway that is going to make this planet much less hospitable for human life 50, 100, 150 years from now. Right, so it's not just can we address inequality. There are a whole host of policy issues that it seems we can't effectively address within this institutional structure. And Tubin is saying, well, let's tweak and change the institutional structure. Fukuyama says, no, actually, this institutional structure is very hard to change, in part because the amendment process is so hard, in part because the flaws in the institutions lead us to be skeptical about government as an agent of change, and then we get in this self-reinforcing cycle where we want things to change, but it goes back to where's the outrage? Well, there's some outrage there, but people don't believe there's an instrument that can effectively address the conditions that we're outraged about. And
We're
so
still
we're
addressing
stuck.
the same issues and going back to, I'm sorry, what's your name? Eileen, going back to Eileen's concern about states' rights. I mean, that has not changed since the beginning.
Yeah, and it's likely to get worse under the Roberts Court. Commerce Clause stuff is
There are
coming
not that
out.
many issues.
I happened to pick up the book written 39 years ago by John Kenneth Galbraith, in which he pointed out that although the genesis of the revolution was an objection to taxation without representation, we have a strong heritage in this country of opposition to taxation even with representation. And this no tax mood is heightened at this point and is basic to blocking almost every legislative item has some cost to it. It may be saving money in a longer range perspective, but there are immediate causes, and it's attacked as a tax, and it's taking our money. And a state like Mississippi receives 3 times as much money from the federal government as it gives to the federal government, and yet they can campaign successfully in Mississippi against taxes.
Yeah.
What's the book? What was the author?
Galbraith,
John Kenneth Galbraith, the famous economist.
And Joseph Stiglitz, who might be the Galbraith of the early 21st century, has written, I think, quite persuasively about the structural budget crisis that we face and the fact that we tax, if you look at federal taxation, almost, we're not quite down to half what the OECD average is, right? But we tax way less than most of the societies that we compare ourselves with. If you combine state and local with federal tax, we're up to almost 2/3, but we're still taxing way less. And the result is particularly when you look at our level of defense spending, which is much higher than all the people that we compare ourselves with. If you look at our entitlement programs, combined with the fact that we can't bring our medical care expenses under control, it means there's almost nothing left for so-called discretionary spending, which includes education, infrastructure, environmental protection, regulation of industries, right? And it's going to get worse, not better, because eventually interest rates are going to go up, and then, right, we're going to have to spend what little money we have left in our budget maintaining our debt, as opposed to spending on anything. And so, yes, I completely agree. And again, this is not necessarily a redistributive issue. It has a redistributive side, which taxation, to my mind, should be redistributive. But it's simply a collective action problem. There's all the stuff that we should be doing if we want to be a competitive economy in the middle of the 21st century that we're not doing because we don't have the capacity, literally, the fiscal capacity to do it. Yes?
Does anybody raise the question that the cycle that is being set up by the tremendous inequality and everything had some historical precedents as far as revolutions are concerned, and that eventually those that are so much subjected to the tyranny of the majority or the wealthy get to the point where they rebel or they, I would think that anarchists and revolutionaries are very happy about what's going on because it's going to speed up their idea of revolution taking the change. But the conservatives don't seem to think that's even an option. You know, they don't even think about that.
So let me say a couple and quite varied things to respond to that. And one of them is just to plug one of the books that I'm recommending to you. I have nothing to do with it. But there's this book called The Spirit Level, which is by Wilkinson and Pickett, Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett, and they're both English public health doctors. And what they study is the social health consequences of relative levels of inequality. And so they have a complicated metric of social health, which includes life expectancy, infant mortality, rates of drug abuse, rates of violence, rates of incarceration, rates of obesity. And they suggest, I think, very persuasively, that whether you look at the same society across time, two different societies at the same time, or subsets of the same society, like comparing different states in the United States, wherever inequality is higher, social health is diminished. And wherever equality is greater, social health is better. Yeah.
What is the title of it? Social consequences of relative what?
Oh, so you have the it's actually called The Spirit Level. Right. This is the title of the book. Why greater equality makes society stronger. But very quickly, they identify a mechanism. And so it's one thing to have a correlation, right? To say more inequality, less health, more equality, greater health. It's another thing to understand why that is. And so this is where the fact that they're doctors doing public health research comes in. And they suggest that the more unequal a society is, the more you compare yourself with people with whom there is a status differential between you and them. And by the way, it doesn't tend to be the bottom comparing themselves with the top. The bottom compares themselves with the next group, and the next group compares themselves with the next group. And so what really matters is what's called the gradation of inequality between those groups that compare themselves. And if it's small, there's less of a status differential, and there's less anxiety about downward mobility. And if it's high, you know that you don't drive the same car, or live in the same kind of home, or wear the same clothes, or send your children to the same schools, or take the same vacations, and you become much more prone to insecurity and anxiety about your social standing, and that, among other things, prompts cortisol production, which is a stress hormone, which has all of these negative health consequences. Now, why am I saying all this in response to your question? Because one of the things they point out, and I tried to do this before, but there's no chalk on the chalkboard, so I'm going to draw an equation. It's a simple equation. When you increase scarcity, you almost always increase competition, right? And we are at a historical moment where we have increased scarcity. There are just not as many good jobs, right? There are not as many good opportunities. And increased competition is bad for collective action, right? It's bad for politics because as opposed to people saying, how can we get together to change this? They say, how can I get money? Right? And so there's a self-reinforcing cycle, or there's several self-reinforcing cycles that tend to make it difficult to envision getting out of the trap we've got ourselves into. And I know this is not happy, but I do think that honest diagnosis is the first step in trying to figure out what to do. And that the problem with someone like Tubin, who glibly says that the Constitution is a problem, let's rework the Constitution, is that there's just a whole bunch of reasons to think that that's a really, really heavy lift.
Amazing that Stevens writes a book.
Yes.
And suggests 5 or 6 constitutional amendments.
Yeah. And I mean, that who knows if that will be the start of a more sustained conversation, because I think there's some good recommendations in there about, for instance, not mitigating against campaign finance reform or preventing gerrymandering, which I think are two major factors that tend to produce political apathy in our society. But the question is, outside of the people who read the New York Times or the New Yorker, who are probably mainly already convinced of this, is there going to be a broader conversation? Danny, you look like you're on the cusp of saying something.
Well, I wanted to talk about Tubin and Fukuyama because when I was reading Tubin, I was, going along, being interested by the article, and then I got to the end and I thought that's all you have to say.
Right. Yeah.
So I was really struck by that because, he's the big New Yorker writer about the Supreme Court and all of that. So I don't know. I was surprised to agree so much with Fukuyama because I don't normally find myself in that camp.
Yeah.
But
well, I'm not sure Fukuyama's in the same camp that you think he is in, which is to say, I'm not sure that he's a neocon.
Yeah.
Anymore.
Yeah.
To be clear, so Fukuyama's book that we talked about at the very beginning, The History of the Last Man, was very important to the Bush administration's rationale for invading Iraq. Fukuyama was not at all happy. And so, if you read, this article is an excerpt from a book that's a second volume of a book that's a broad sociological study of the history of political institutions. If you read the first volume, there's a little bit of some residual conservatism in it, but I don't think it's the case that he's a doctrinaire.
Sure. Yeah.
But go ahead.
Well, I find it, he certainly falls on a part of the conservative spectrum, and I found it really refreshing to see someone fall, anywhere who is interested in talking seriously about constitutional reform or change, because it is such a third rail of sorts.
Yeah.
No one wants to talk about it, and it's quite tiring to see that all the time. So I don't know. I want to seek out responses to what Fukuyama had to say, and Stevens' book, which I haven't read at all yet, but I'm very curious about.
Let me give you a very quick response to Fukuyama's article. And so the background idea here, I think, is that the Europeans have competent bureaucracies and strong executives. And that as a result, they get a lot more done than the U.S. does, and that they are much less easily penetrated by organized interests in their lawmaking process, right?
And much more progressive than we are because of that, because they can get things done.
But see, I think for Fukuyama, it's just competence. It's
Yeah.
because he's not progressive. I mean, he may not be neoconservative anymore, but he's certainly not gone over to the other side.
And they don't have military budgets.
That is another thing.
Right,
But
right.
so my initial reaction against Fukuyama is that it's an overly technocratic idea of politics. And so, yes, I agree that we would be better served if we had competence in our executive bureaucracy than not, right? I mean, that's hard to disagree with. But I also find it a little bit narrow to say that's the central thing that's wrong with American politics today. And so we could talk about inequality, but let me talk about participation for a moment instead, and to suggest that one of the things that the European technocratic model of politics tends to do is to, Max Weber has this wonderful phrase, the German sociologist from 100 years ago, he calls it the intellectual proletarianization of the electorate. That is to say, you take away all their property. If you have a really competent bureaucracy and you trust everything to them, well, they'll get everything done, but what role does that leave to the average voter? And I'm inclined to think that we actually do better in terms of justice and ultimately in terms of responsiveness to changing facts on the ground when there's more direct participation in politics. And so without now I'm beginning to edge into my own research, and I won't go very far there, but that I think there may be some more participatory alternatives to relying on competent bureaucracies for addressing the failings of the American administrative state, and that Fukuyama doesn't want to go down that path probably because he mistrusts democracy.
Would you go down the path a little bit to explain what you're thinking?
Sure. For a moment, and because unless you want to like call out for dinner, I can't go too far down the path. So the basic idea here is one of escaping from what I would call a state-centered way of thinking about politics, which is to say that we in society identify a problem and then we tell our legislators about it, and they come up with a proposal, and then they pass a law, and an administrative agency carries out that law, and they fix the problem, right? And so all political action is channeled through the state. And yes, we need the state, and yes, the state is unrivaled in its power to change our social circumstances. But if the way in which we relate to the state is exclusively in this kind of delegatory way, just give it the power to solve our problems and let them handle it, oftentimes the state gets captured by powerful interests, or the state is non-responsive to the way in which its policies come back and do perverse and unintended things. And so there are interesting proposals for allowing popular participation in both the formulation of policy, which we could talk about citizen juries or different forms of rotating participation in legislative bodies, and at the same time, direct participation in administration, in a sense of saying to a locality, here's the mandate. You have to clean this watershed, right? But we're not going to tell you how. We're going to tell you here's a time frame, and here's the best practice, and here's what it results in. But if there's an alternative way that you can come up with using your local knowledge and through direct participation, then run with it. And if it turns out it's not a best practice and it doesn't do the trick, then you're going to have to change. But if it turns out it's as good as the best practice and has other advantages for you, then go for it. And so, I mean, I'm putting it in very simple terms, right? There's a whole literature on trying to reform the administrative state to allow for more Fiona, I imagine, must be aware of this, but has no interest in it. And I, for one, have interest in
Does
it.
this call for a much greater degree of decentralization?
No, because at least in the way in which decentralization tends to be used in American political discourse, that goes right down the state rights path. And the difference is that say the federal government is telling you, this is what you got to do, right? Not this is how you got to do it. And the federal government is saying, and here's how much money we're going to give you to do it, right?
So these are funded mandates.
Funded mandates, and at the same time, the mandate is to accomplish an end, but not to tell you what the means to that end is. But also to tell you, by the way, here's the way other localities have done it, and this is the rate of success that they've had. And you have to do at least that good, or else you lose the privilege of devising your own solution. And there have been some experiments along these lines, and they have had pretty good results for the most part. And what you find is that both there's local information that large bureaucracies don't have, and that there's actually often a lot of enthusiasm about the opportunity to participate in problem solving. Yeah.
So two things. One is, I know in Massachusetts, I've seen elsewhere, we have ballot initiatives.
Right.
So when things don't get, things aren't like, right now we have a minimum wage bill, there's an earned sick time bill, there's a bottle bill, there's a casino bill that people are trying to get out of. So that is sort of way around the failure of the legislature to do some of this stuff, and also something that sometimes does motivate the legislature to get going when they see that the right number of signatures are being collected, and this is going to be on the ballot, maybe the outcome won't be what they want. So that is one.
Yeah.
One of the things that I consider slightly concerned over what you're saying is that this seems a little close to the idea well the corporations can regulate themselves in a way. I mean, it's very different on one level, but in another level, it's sort of like it's taking the state out totally or a lot, and that there's enough kind of oversight that is proved to be actually useful.
Which is going to sort of at times runs into the problem that California's had for the last 60 years, where every time they need to raise their taxes, it goes to a ballot initiative, and every 2 years you're voting to raise your taxes, you're going to tell them eventually, excuse my French.
Yeah. And the interesting thing here, I mean, obviously California has had anti-gay rights and anti-immigration, popular ballot initiatives, and what I'm talking about, to be clear, is not a popular ballot initiative, and I think in a sense it's really important to see the difference between a popular ballot initiative and direct participation in the administration of a federally mandated and funded program, right? So the popular ballot initiative is the state-centered model of politics. The irony of the California initiative system seems to be that oftentimes, if you wait 5 or 10 years, exactly the opposite happens, at least with gay rights and immigration issues. But that doesn't mean that those 5 or 10 years aren't bad years while the initiative is in force. And by the way, the anti-affirmative action initiative is still in force. So, I just saw the time, and I have to put a letter of recommendation in the mail before the post office on campus closes at 4 o'clock. So I'm going to call.
5 minutes.
Yeah, I know. I can make it.